Okay, so Joe and I both put in separate presentations. Mine was about landscape character and complexity, and by coincidence, Joe's was about landscape complexity and citizen participation. So they work quite neatly together. Yes, thank you all for staying behind. I wondered if anyone from HS2 has stayed behind here as well, because I know there's a few people. Oh, hello, you're there. So I'm not going to change anything, because I'm talking about the positives for landscape that infrastructure, linear infrastructure, can bring. So I'm going to have reference to HS2, but I'm also going to be talking generally, and also about how you can create new character, and how landscape professionals and landscape architects can help lead that process. So this is the main message of my talk throughout, really, is that we need to put good landscape in, and as landscape architects, we've got all that information to hand. We understand the landscape, we've got all the data, we've got the fantastic national character areas and the landscape character assessment process. We've got information on historic landscape character, we've got information on tranquility, we've got information on dark skies, and all that information and our understanding, we can put that into landscape and help guide the design and get infrastructure out that fits the landscape. But also, we can also get really good landscape out of infrastructure, and we need to think about looking sort of away from build limits, away from the strict red line boundaries of construction, and look beyond that at wider character. And then as landscape architects, we're involved in and we understand things like green infrastructure strategies we produce. We're involved in biodiversity areas, which all have targets and aspirations and needs. We produce landscape strategies. We produce countryside stewardship targeting for agricultural land. All our designated landscapes have statutory management plans. And these all have aims, objectives, targets, aspirations, long cherished things that people want for their landscapes. So the idea is that we should be using infrastructure, properly designed infrastructure, to try and get those things out of it, and need to sort of look beyond the sort of red line boundaries and look at how we fit within the wider landscape. So that's really what I'm going to say in the nutshell for the rest of the 20 minutes. So I am going to use HS2 as a case study, and just for the people who don't know about it, and I'm sure that a lot of us have worked on it, but it runs up from, HS1 runs up from Kent to London, the Channel Tunnel rail link. HS2 phase 1 runs from London to the West Midlands. I think it's about 119 miles, and then we've got the two loops going up, the fork going up to Manchester and Leeds. The phase 1 had went through the hybrid build process and had royal assent in February this year. So it is starting to happen. There is preliminary work going on the ground, and the aim is it will be completed to 2026. So I've been working tangentially on HS2 for about the last 6 years, and I was thinking, hopefully this might take me up till I can have my last sort of my leaving the profession ride on HS2, perhaps up to Birmingham as my last bit of my profession in 10 years' time. So we've got trains of up to 400 kilometres an hour, up to 18 trains each way. So that's just a bit so you know about it. So just looking at landscape. So landscape is complex. We have got the national character areas as our framework, but even in that small phase 1 bit, I think there's about 16 national character areas. And then if you're looking as a landscape architect and looking at landscape and visual impact assessment, there's each of those districts and counties all have their own landscape character assessments. And so we've broken it down into tiny, tiny, tiny bits. And I suppose one of the themes I'm thinking about is that by breaking down into really detailed character areas and looking at impacts on those character areas, perhaps we've lost the sight of the big picture, and perhaps the landscape and visual impact assessment process doesn't really give us what we need out of it to help get good landscape design in and good landscape design out of the process. And I must say, to HS2, I'm not saying this is a criticism. This is an awful lot of work has gone into the environmental impact assessment. And I think there's 26 volumes for community forum areas. There's a whole load of baseline appendices and maps books. It's over 50,000 pages long. And we've got separate chapters on things like agricultural land quality, air quality, community, cultural heritage, ecology, biodiversity, and landscape and visual impact is just one of those chapters within it. And in fact, landscape and places come into all of those chapters. And I like this cartoon, which is HS2 Appeal. Good job done. And I think the process can be quite reductionist because it doesn't look at the place as a whole. And it says here, it's just a few houses, a couple of newts, and besides, it's nowhere near where I live. So it's just breaking it down into those sort of little bits of information. And I tried to get the picture of I think there's a picture of it being delivered, the environmental statement being delivered in a big van. So there's a lot of work, but I'm not sure if it gives us really what we want. It's quite a reductionist approach. And I think as landscape architects, we can do more and can do better. So obviously we're familiar with landscape as the integrating spatial framework, and the European Landscape Convention, which we are still and will still be signed up to, is an area that's the important words as perceived by people, whose character is a result of the action and interaction of natural and human factors. So seeing landscape as bringing all those elements of the sort of environmental, all those elements of the environment together within landscape as the integrating framework. So I was looking at this, we are familiar with this picture of landscape involving the landform, topography, biodiversity, how the land is used and managed, its history, and our experience of the landscape as all the factors that come into landscape. And really I was just looking at that, really looking at the different EIA chapters, how they all these different separate chapters of sound, noise, vibration, cultural heritage, they all involve thinking about the landscape. And I suppose the point here is there an opportunity? And I'm really interested in attending some of the seminars this afternoon on the natural capital approach and the framing of the natural environment and the landscape as an opportunity or as a benefit or an asset, as opposed to simply a constraint or a backdrop that absorbs the impacts, and think more holistically about effects on ecosystem services, and can we use infrastructure to increase and enhance those benefits rather than just the impacts on it. So I'm going to look at some work that we did for Buckinghamshire County Council, who obviously took in a very opposed position to the railway running through their county. I think there's 60 kilometres, about a third of the route runs, so it cuts right through south to north within the county. And just their opportunities, perhaps thinking more holistically about a landscape-led approach. They thought the environmental statement was very generic and engineering-led, very reductionist, and they wanted to try and bring that information together and try and think more positively about design principles, how you could design a better route through the county. And it is a very distinct county. You've got, comes out from London, but immediately becomes a very rural, very dark skies, a very tranquil rural landscape. You've got the Chilterns sitting right on the edge of London. You've got the Colne Valley Park. You've got very diverse. You go through the chalk of the Chilterns, dip down into the clay of Aylesbury Vale, and then cross the Ouse Valley. So you've got very, very distinct landscapes. So the idea from Buckinghamshire was they wanted to look at those, and they roughly equate to the 5 national characters, look at each of those characters and look at if there's an opportunity for a landscape-led approach rather than a landscape impact approach. And they're looking at a positive, HS2 to provide a positive and lasting legacy in the Buckinghamshire context. And I think what was really good about this piece of work, it was moving from a position of no, and that all stakeholders working separately. And as Kate Collins said in the last session, it became to a position of stakeholders perhaps working more together. And this became the sort of a platform for getting people, diverse people like the National Trust and the Forestry Commission, all the different local authorities and the Bucks County Council and Historic England to perhaps work together and think about what they could achieve working together rather than separately sort of being negative. And I think it didn't do the whole work, but at least having this piece of work started the conversation. And the other thing I want to say, this was a very small piece of work, so it wasn't a massive budget like an environmental statement. I think the budget was about £15,000, so there was a lot of people involved. So a lot of them were able to put in a small amount of money into that pot and then produce something bigger from it. Again, that's thinking about landscape being the complexity of landscape, but when you put all those different layers together, you get more than the sum of the parts. So there is railway infrastructure in the Chilterns already. So this is Brunel's Bridge over the Goring Gap at Gatehampton. It's a Grade 2 listed monument. And so one of the questions was to us was, well, can we have something like this? And I think Brunel's maxim that on the Great Western Railway that any of his railway structure should be an adornment to the landscape, was a good one to follow. But obviously, a new brick-built viaduct, which is what people were expecting, it's not an option for HS2. But, for example, there's an example here of one of Brunel's tunnel portals further down on the Great West Railway. And an example of tunnel portals, I think this is on HS1. So we can't do much about perhaps the portals. We're not looking at building new little crenellated structures, but perhaps we can do more about how they are integrated in the landscape. So this portal, for example, comes out in a deep cutting. You don't actually see it until you're on top of it, but there are things like noise fences and security fences which then sit up at the top of the cutting. So though the railway in itself isn't an impact, it's those fences that block the views which are an impact. You can do very small design changes to change those. So I'm going to go further, focus further in and look at HS2 in the Chilterns, the A and B. So it is in tunnel for roughly half of the A and B. I think it's about 8 kilometres, and there's about 9 kilometres where it comes out of the tunnel, and it's on a combination, much of it on cutting and then on viaducts and then through green tunnels until it goes through the wind gap at Wendover and goes out onto the Aylesbury plain. So the sort of bill limits boundary is very close to, it's not on this picture, but it's very close to the line. But this study was looking at the wide, and the first dotted line was sort of 3 kilometres, and the second buffer is 5 kilometres. So it's really looking at, when you're looking at infrastructure, you're not looking at just doing mitigation and changes within the red line. You need to look at that whole sort of 3 to 5 kilometre buffer around it to help proper integration. So the first thing we did is we looked at all of the chapters in the environmental statement. So we didn't just look at landscape and visual. And we tried to understand what those impacts as a whole were on that place. And tried to make it very simple and also very easy to understand, very graphic, and something that all the different stakeholders would sign up to. And it wasn't supposed to replicate sort of the 50,000 pages. This was only 4 pages for each of those 5 national character areas. And then with the stakeholders, really very, very simple principles for each of the character areas. And again, these might sound simplistic, but I think they are important in starting to think about a landscape-led design. And also, I think, obviously, in the environmental statement, you always have to represent the worst-case scenario, which means that you're not always getting these design principles. And then the fear is that the forward-looking design principles would be lost as it sort of moves once it has ascent and moves forward. So just really simple principles like For example, the environmental statement drawings were showing things like woodland infill, which was screening the line, had a screening purpose, but because it was mainly within the boundary, it actually was more sort of had a linear effect and highlighted the line. And there's really subtle topography of the Chilterns where you get this sort of, it runs along the Miston Valley, you get a lot of dry valleys that cross it. So those open dry valleys being important to the landscape structure. And if they were filled with woodland, obviously it would have a screening function, but also completely change that sort of perception of the landscape structure. So a really simple set of about 15 principles for each of those areas. So the outcomes, I think Buckinghamshire has felt that this approach has sort of bringing all the aspects of landscape together has given them an evidence base for petitioning. It gave them a way of setting out their key asks for the Buckingham landscape. And HS2 has obviously responded positively and now has a very good landscape design approach and an approach to mitigation and integration of HS2 within the Chilterns AONB. So the assurances from the select committee process were to set up, and I'm only just going to focus on the Chilterns, where wider assurances for Buckinghamshire as a whole was to set up a Chilterns review group to sort of manage the process of design in the AONB, and to recognise that you're looking at enhancement and integration measures beyond just the development boundary and an additional to those in the ES, and to develop detailed design principles which then be passed on to the main works contractor and be used as a basis for the applications to the local authorities. So we have the position now where we have Chilterns environment enhancement and integration plan, and its purpose is to best mitigate the impacts of the railway within the AONB and integrate the railway within the special landscape and incorporating enhancements. So it's a visionary plan. It's got two parts to it. There's detailed design principles to applied within the bill limits, and then outside additional integration, and that will be funded up to 3 million by HS2 to further integrate the scheme. So two things really. We're taking a one landscape approach, so we're looking at landscape as that integrating factor and looking at natural, cultural, perceptual and aesthetic qualities. So we're looking at the whole of those things that come together to create landscapes. We're looking at one landscape across the bill limits and across the wider landscape, not just concentrating on immediately close to the line. And it's looking about continuing to engage stakeholders. And again, I think this is something that as landscape practitioners that we can do well. We can take that role and we can bring in inputs from people on biodiversity, bring in inputs from people on cultural heritage and bring them together into a place-based approach. And it's a way, we've had one main consultation workshop, we've got another one next week, and it's a way of engaging people to think positively and how the railway can also help them achieve their aspirations for the landscape. So we've had workshops, we've gone from brainstorming of sort of wide ideas and trying to filter down to actual practical projects on the ground. And we have got then signed up to a vision. So HS2 will complement the statutory purpose of the AONB, and it will be a distinctive, beautiful, resilient and connected landscape and a catalyst to improve natural capital and delivery of ecosystem services in ways that conserve and enhance natural beauty. So I just wanted to go, again, these are really just very sketched designs, they're not detailed designs, again, just to start people thinking about what are the opportunities over and above. So this is an example near Wendover. There's a green infrastructure plan in place which says that there are particular needs for people to have access out from the town into the Chilterns. It's in the sort of wind gap where the chalk goes down onto the plain. It's very tight. There's already a National Grid pylon line. There's already the A413. There will be a new piece of linear infrastructure that goes through that. It cuts through the scarp. You've got bits of connected chalk, bits of disconnected chalk downland on the scarp on either side, an ancient woodland. And it's looking at opportunities. Obviously, all the severances of all those different parts of linear infrastructure mean that the option of returning that land back to farmland is very slim, because there'll be just little bits of farmland between other bits of infrastructure. So there's a huge opportunity there to think about creating a bigger resource for people and for wildlife, and creating a new bit of green infrastructure and access links from Wendover out into the Chilterns countryside. And also opportunities in the design. There's a key viewpoint up on the scarp at Coombe Hill, if you know that, which looks down across here, and there are opportunities in the design of that to sort of filter that view to the line. So yeah, opportunities. And these are all at draft stage, so they're all they're just, again, there's conversation starters and thinkers and things that people have come up with that they'd like to see, and things that we've started to think as how we could turn perhaps a negative into a positive. And again, noise barriers, and this is obviously the top one, is not what's been proposed in an AONB, but this is something I pass every day on my journey to work along HS1 in Kent. And I think although the railway could have the fantastic design and be putting cutting, and you can't actually see it from much in the landscape, it's the noise barriers that sit perhaps on top of the cutting or are very unrural in their design, which have a bigger landscape impacts. So we looked at different options for the design and the placing of noise barriers, and recognising that if you do screening, it's not necessarily right up against the barrier within the sort of construction boundary, but it's screening further away within the wider landscape will have better effects. And then we've got 23 components. So I'm just going to show 3 examples. So this is the Holloways, so a really important and quite unique feature to the Chilterns. So they're old drove roads that run up from the valley floor up to sort of the common land on the plateau above. And as the railway line will come along the side of the valley, so it will sever these lines, and also they'll obviously be used for construction. They'll need overbridges. So just looking at principles for some of these, how you could create new Holloways and retain the rural character of the existing Holloways, and then retain that fact, so you're not going up going up an urban road now and then coming out with views as you cross the HS2, but you retain that sort of sense of enclosure, which is really sort of key to the experience of the Chilterns landscape. So it's just, as I say, it's just an 8-kilometre stretch through the AONB. So we've produced a mapping and looked at all the enhancements along that whole stretch. This is just one section. So as I said, that's within the bill limits. But then we've looked at additional projects which extend up to 3 kilometres, up to 10 kilometres around. So clearly, really good opportunity is sort of hedgerow boundary and boundary thickening enhancement over a wider area, and just example of a plan. And then looking at other opportunities for funding. So here there are utility companies, National Grid, who are also providing money for that. So if you look at this relatively small pot from HS2 of money, 3 million, and you look at other money available from other places, you can sort of bring those together and meet multiple objectives and get sort of more for your money. And just another, we've got about 15 project examples, another one looking at extending, enhancing and linking up chalk grassland along sort of cherished objective in all sorts of plans, and maybe using HS2 to achieve those objectives. And so we did some mapping of what those projects could do. Obviously some of them, boundary strengthening, connected habitats, the things we might think of, but also some really interesting projects like a decluttering project for the highway through the Misbourne Valley, interpretation of finds, understanding the story of the landscape, Grimm's Ditch, which is the scheduled monument that the railway cuts through, looking at restoring and creating access to the whole of the 18-kilometre length of Grimm's Ditch and celebrating that, and doing sort of rights-of-way diversions to create a new sort of long-distance footpath. So some quite, at an early stage, but some interesting ideas coming out. And obviously these are things that have been bubbling away in people's heads for quite a long time, and suddenly thinking, oh, actually, we can do this now. We've got the money, we've got, we can take this forward. So this is my last slide, I think. So my main themes were that landscape is complex. It's not just sort of reducing down to what's in the landscape and visual assessment, and putting all those different layers together. Landscape is more than the sum of its parts. And landscape and visual impact assessments, do we need to think differently about how we do it, and is it fit for purpose for infrastructure projects? And is there the opportunity to be more landscape-led in our approach, and opportunities for infrastructure to achieve wider landscape benefits and objectives, and meeting other objectives? And I was asked to mention by Simon that we do have, Landscape Institute do have a lot of technical resources that can help us. So we've got the Green Bridges technical advice, we've got the GI guidance, and perhaps there's also more resources that we need that we can draw on, because there's a lot of experience that we need to start to put together from sort of other infrastructure projects. So, and I just got to do one side. It's just, I just have to advertise that as LUC, we've got an office opening in Manchester, and we've got a party next week. So if you can't make the party tonight, which I can't, there's another party in Manchester. So I'm going to leave that there. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Right, hello, I'm Jo. I'm in my third year of my PhD here at MMU, and my presentation is entitled Reaching for Simplicity, Citizen Participation, Complexity Theory and the Transport Mega Project. So my research is very much based around an understanding of complexity theory, and I'm going to do my best to explain to you what that means. So I came across this quote in my research: I would not give a fig for the simplicity on this side of complexity. I would give my right arm for the simplicity on the far side of complexity. And that's Oliver Wendell Holmes, quite a quotable guy. And this is to explain what I think academics do in their research. We uncover loads of layers of complexity, we look into things, we make things very complicated, and then we have this hope that on the other side of all that, there'll be some kind of simple findings that will be really valuable, but it's that simplicity on the far side of that complexity, and that's what we're looking for. So my research is based around a place called Ashley, which is a rural parish, and it's underneath this orange blob just to the south of Manchester here, very close to the airport. So I've been in Ashley for 2 years now. I've been listening to people, talking to people. I've been walking with them, walking the landscape and making maps with them, and I've been helping them to produce their neighbourhood plan as well. And I've been doing things like joining in litter picks and the village fete and going to the pub. It's a strenuous life for the academic. And I'm going to tell you the story of Ashley. And the story of Ashley is one of transport infrastructure. So originally you just had the river. That's the River Bollin, which forms the main part of Ashley's parish boundary with the city. So that's Manchester, just over the other side of the river there. And that was used by the Romans. There's evidence of Roman landing stages in the river. But then the first built infrastructure is the network of minor roads in Ashley, which would have arisen from the medieval field boundaries. So this transport infrastructure has very much emerged from the place. next bit of the story is the Victorian railway line, which was built on a north-south alignment through the middle of the parish, cutting it in two, and built very much not particularly for the residents of Ashley themselves. It's built so that people from the Cheshire towns like Knutsford can get into Manchester and vice versa. But it does have quite an impact on Ashley because they got a station. So all the dairy produce that's produced in Ashley now has a market in Manchester. And then much later on, but the next significant bit of transport infrastructure, built east-west through the parish this time, again cutting it in two, is the M56, which was built in 1971. This one very much not emerging from the place. It leaves Ashley between two motorway junctions, which means that Ashley's used as a cut-through by people trying to avoid blockages on the motorway. And this is something imposed on Ashley for external reasons, really. And then the runway 2 of Manchester Airport, which is slightly off the map, but it's just to the bottom, just to the southern boundary of the parish. And again, it's quite a long piece of linear infrastructure that projects out into the parish and has a lot of landscape impact visually and because of the noise, but mostly because of traffic and related development around the airport, which is growing very quickly. So this story of this place is very much not of an unchanging, timeless rural landscape. And it's not a national park, it's not an area of outstanding natural beauty, it's quite an ordinary place. But then so most of the places all down the line to Birmingham and to London, there's a lot of ordinary rural places like this. So, the future of Ashley then, the future story of the infrastructure of Ashley, is the HS2 line, which will come through and isolate the village, as you can see, on this island of land between the M56 and the proposed line. And I'm interested in the additional layer of complexity of this piece of infrastructure and what will happen to the future in the future of this parish. So, it's a cumulative impact that I'm talking about and that I'm interested in. So just to explain a little bit more about the complexity theory aspect with Ashley as an example, all the post-its here are indicating different systems within the system that we would call the landscape. So let's have a look at a few of these. So the soil system, as we all know, is very much a changing system. It's dynamic. The soil is never static. It's mostly made up of living organisms, and the condition and the nature of that soil can change. So you've got a changeable system there. But it's also very much open to all the other systems in the landscape. So obviously, it's open to the agricultural system. So farming practices obviously affect the soil, and the soil affects what you can produce. So that's a nice clear relationship of two systems that are constantly changing and constantly in relationship to each other. Then the wildlife, another system, clearly dependent on the nature of the soils and on what the farming practices are. So those are some physical systems that we all know are interrelated and changeable. But then I've put the pub on there as representing the social systems of Ashley, because that's where the farmers are. They're in the pub discussing the soils and the wildlife and the farming practices. And what they do, the social system of Ashley, and the things that people do, as we know because we're landscape architects, is all very much related to all these social systems, to the physical systems. And they're in the pub and they're talking about the landowner as well. So the system of land ownership is particularly important in Ashley because one man owns almost the whole parish, almost all of the farmland and quite a lot of the buildings. So most people there are his tenants. So as you can imagine, that's quite a big impact on the landscape as a whole. And then there's the walkers who come over the river from the city walking their dogs. There's the cyclists who come through Ashley at weekends, really annoying the local people by going around all the bends of the medieval layout of the roads. There's me. I've become part of the landscape of Ashley which I never intended to do, but it's obviously happened, and things that I do affect the landscape of Ashley, and the landscape of Ashley affects me. So what I'm saying is that all these things are constantly changing and open to each other, and that's something that I understand through complexity theory. The best example of this, the clearest example I think, is the river itself, because a river is made from very simple ingredients. So the river Bollin is an emergent entity, which means that it's simply made of water molecules. And we know what water molecules are, don't we? We know what happens if you freeze them or if you boil them. We understand about water, and we also know quite a lot about the soils that the river's flowing through. But even though our knowledge of those basic ingredients cannot lead us to predict what the course of the river will be. It is completely unpredictable, and you look at the course of that river over the decades on the different maps, and it does change quite a lot, meaning the boundary of the city changes, different bits of land get cut off and are suddenly part of a different farm. So it's the complexity theory comes in here because the basic ingredients of the river do not let us predict what the landscape form will be, and it's true of all these systems. So they're constantly changing and open, which makes them unpredictable. Obviously, I'm interested in what happens when you add that extra layer of complexity to another system to these systems, and particularly the station, because there will be a station roughly in that position at Manchester Airport, and you will be able to walk to the station from Ashley, and it's certainly an easy bike ride to the station. So that's going to have a huge impact on Ashley. So what I think could happen in this situation is a phase transition. So if you like, if we're talking about the story of the place, the story so far in Ashley has been a kind of a landscape soap opera. Everything burbles along, the setting is broadly the same, the actors are broadly the same, all the post-its are roughly the same, they might change a bit. There's a sort of constant change within a fairly predictable framework. It's very much like the Archers. But when you get a phase transition, which is a term I've got from complexity theory, suddenly landscape drama. And there's no reason to think that everything will just continue changing in a predictable way in Ashley, because I don't think it will. So just to explain what a phase transition is, you can think of it as a change from one state of affairs to another state of affairs, in effect a massive plot twist in the landscape. An example I like is at some point in the history of the Earth, there were only single-celled organisms. As far as the eye could see, the tedium of single-celled organisms, a bit like this one here. But they gradually reached a level of complexity within that single cell. And as that complexity built up, it reached a tipping point, and then phase transition occurred, and suddenly you had multicellular life forms, which mean we can have plants, we can have animals, we can have physicists, and no matter how much big data you had collected about those single-celled life forms, you could not have predicted Professor Brian Cox. It's just not predictable. So that's what a phase transition can be like. A landscape example of a phase transition that we'll all be familiar with this is Manchester in 1840. The Industrial Revolution obviously meant a phase transition in how people related to their landscape. So from earning their living in a very close relationship to the land, farming the land, suddenly the majority of people are living in cities, and we've invented cities, and they are a different way of relating to the landscape. So that would be a phase transition. So the next chapter for Ashley then, I've been thinking about what happens if you get a phase transition in Ashley. And I showed the HS2 alignment map to a planning officer at the local authority, which is Cheshire East. And that planning officer reacted a bit like he'd never seen the HS2 alignment before, which worried me a bit. But he said, oh, I see. Right, well, I can't see that staying in the green belt post HS2. And he could well be right. So it's greenbelt at the moment, but I've developed a few scenarios, and this is just one of them, that illustrate what perhaps might happen in Ashley and places like it. So if it was removed from the greenbelt, for example, stage 1, you get Airport City overspill. So Airport City is huge warehouses and distribution centres taking up a lot of land just over the border in the neighbouring parish. Perhaps that spills over because the airport and the station become even more successful and there's lots of economic growth. And then you need new housing for more workers, and also housing because a lot of housing is demanded by the local plan in Manchester and in Cheshire East. And then you get hotels and car parks in the parish, conference centres. In fact, there's already planning permission applied for at one of the farms to turn it into a conference centre because you're an hour from London. So it's very, very easy for someone to come from London to a conference in Ashley. And then finally, the final stage, farmhouses perhaps might switch from agricultural use to all being service industries. I've showed this to a couple of farmers in Ashley, this particular map, and they've said, well, we know this will happen. I'm not saying they're definitely right, this isn't a prediction, but they think it's quite possible. So, the future then of rural Cheshire could look a bit like this, I think. And I haven't picked Bovis for any particular reason, but just the volume house builders, I think, are going to move in, and that commercial interests could well prevail over the future of our rural places. And just very ordinary rural places everywhere. What's to stop those bits of severed land that are sliced off by HS2 just going over all to housing development? This one is from Cheshire, Saxon Lee in Cheshire. My personal point of view is that I don't want commercial interests to prevail. Ian Nairn, the architectural critic, wrote a special edition of the Architectural Review in 1955. So in the context of post-war development, he travelled from the south of England up to Carlisle, and he wrote about what he observed on the way. And he said it would be good if on leaving Southampton, you felt that you were doing something different to arriving in Carlisle. So you should know that you're in a different place. It should be a different experience. There should be some distinctiveness. And he said that in 1955 that wasn't the case, and he called the edition was called Outrage. And I think we could be faced with some kind of, in a worst case scenario, universal low density mess is his phrase. I think there's a risk of that now. So what could stand between rural landscapes and this problem? Well, I've been looking into whether HS2 Limited's public engagement strategy might save us. And the short answer is I don't think it will. There's the 50,000-page environmental statement that Kate was talking about is used as the main public consultation document. And I could go into a lot more detail about that, but those 50,000 pages are what ordinary people have to react to in order to make their petition to Parliament. So my research finding is that the public engagement strategy of HS2 is very much transmission of information from the top down in such a way as to cause the least possible public resistance. And in fact, someone from HS2 Public Engagement told me to my face that they just wanted to get the bill through Parliament as quickly as possible. They just want to reduce the amount of petitions to Parliament. I've also been looking into whether neighbourhood planning could save us. And I'm still working on this, so I haven't come to a firm conclusion. This image is from Tintagel Parish Council, and they're clearly they believe in neighbourhood planning because look, here are some black women, some Asian men, some older people, some younger people, there's even a guy with a hood there, all getting involved in their local landscape. And there's that woman in the middle pointing very powerfully as if to say, this is what's going to happen in my parish. And I'm afraid through helping people initially make their neighbourhood plan, and through reading a lot about it, I think it's very unlikely that this is how it really works. Of course, locally generated goals are the ideal, but actually there's an argument that neighbourhood planning just makes people complicit in the development of their own neighbourhood, because you can't have a neighbourhood plan that doesn't allocate sites for development. The neighbourhood plan has to allocate sites, which most people don't actually want. So, in conclusion then, because I'm interested in this idea of cascading development that could happen and wondering about how we could face that challenge, I've been wondering about cascading engagement. Is it possible to spark off a process where people are exponentially engaged with their own landscapes? Could we tap into that power of just ordinary people in order to change things and use those people really? But I'm not sure how this would work yet. So the idea of cascading engagement would be very simple ingredients with a big impact. And I'm thinking about questions like, should citizens routinely initiate their own landscape proposals? Can a landscape phase transition even be steered? Is it possible? If you think back to the Industrial Revolution example, would it have been possible to steer that even if you could have seen it coming? Maybe not. Could cascading engagement be an answer, and if so, what might the rules of engagement be? And how could citizens just participate in a simple way with something that's so very complex? And that's it. Thank you.